And thank you as well for coming to spend your lunch hour to hear about the corn returns and the corn laws. I can imagine most of you would probably prefer to be eating bread rather than hearing about the ingredients. But nonetheless, I'm here today to talk about the corn laws, but particularly the corn returns, which is the data resource that the British state in the late 17th, 18th, and early 19th century spent thousands of pounds on a yearly basis monitoring corn markets in outports and in market towns in order to enforce the corn laws. And I hope what I'm going to do today is to dispel some of the myths that you might have about the corn laws, the idea that these were the result of the Continental Blockade or the Napoleonic Wars, and actually to suggest that there's something much more ancient than that they were in fact established in the 1690s. They changed form over the course of the 18th century, and by the 19th century, they played a role in the theorization of early political economy. So, to give you a quick overview of the talk, what am I going to do in the next hour? First of all, I think we should reflect a little bit about why we're interested in grain markets at all. Why would a financial historian be spending so much time thinking about grain markets? Why would a research center in financial history go to the vast expense and effort of digitizing 6 million data points that speak to the price of corn and the quantity of corn sold in the 19th century, when surely we could be doing things that are more relevant to financial markets today? And then I'm going to go ahead and give you an overview of the actual historical material. How did English and Welsh grain markets actually work? What are the corn returns? What are the corn laws? And what are these debates that this data source underpins? But first, with respect to our interest in grain markets, I think it's fair to say that this is an example of the British state making a commitment to evidence-based policy. Quite contrary to what we usually hear about political economy, that the first political economists, who indeed were moral philosophers, but the idea that they were reasoning from first principles, that they didn't care about empirics, that this is all about theory, is actually not true. The reality is that they were very much concerned about the empirical basis for their formulations of economic rent, of corn prices, of corn rent, and they had a data source available to them that was financed by the English state with which to reason about these markets. So hopefully it will convince you that not only is early political economy, but also its predecessor, mercantilism, built not just on theoretical reasoning, but also on empirical research. And I think that is a very important thing to take away from this, because one thing we certainly believe at the Center for Financial History is that evidence-based policy is essential. And I think there's a much longer tradition of this in this country than people who have been around for the last 20 or 30 years would necessarily be inclined to think. And I also want to suggest that the corn returns themselves were central to the reasoning of Adam Smith, of David Ricardo, and of Thomas Malthus, and that we can see that very easily by looking at these debates about the corn laws. But more than that, grain markets are very relevant to financial markets today. Although agricultural futures contracts represent less than 1% of total futures contracts traded globally, the wheat future remains the paradigmatic future for regulatory authorities, particularly in the US, when they're thinking about these markets. And moreover, when Holbrook Working was theorizing about the efficient markets hypothesis, long before he looked at equity prices, he was looking at wheat futures in the Chicago Board of Trade. So the notion of futures markets and the spot markets that underpin them as fertile ground for theorizing about futures markets and how to regulate them is something that was true in early 20th century America, and it was also true in early 19th century Britain. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on to an overview of English and Welsh grain markets. But before I do that, I'm going to do one thing as a diversion. I put this in at the last minute. I wanted to show you actually that Adam Smith does in fact take wheat prices that were generated by the early corn returns and actually provides them to you in a table in the Wealth of Nations. He doesn't graph them, I graph them for you, but he lists them sequentially from actually the late 1590s, but in this case I showed you the mid-1640s, all the way up to 1760, because he wants to demonstrate the volatility of wheat, and he wants to illustrate in his digression on silver why it is the case that those landlords who received tithes and rents and wheat were largely better off than those who received them in money. So even as early as Adam Smith, these corn returns that I'm talking about were very central to his discussion on what is money and what is rent. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about how British grain markets worked in this period, because one thing that must be said about these 6 million data points is they still represent only about 25 to 50% of the total grain bought and sold in Britain in the 19th century. We're talking here about market towns, which were heavily regulated. The justices of the peace were forced to appoint an inspector. That inspector could not be involved in the grain trade, and that inspector had to inspect the accounts of all of the traders in the market and certify the average price paid and the quantities bought and sold in a given week, and to report those to the corn commissioner. So these are heavily regulated markets, but there were also market fairs that were less heavily regulated. They were seasonal, and they generally applied to seasonal crops. But again, these are open markets. Private markets, on the other hand, certainly existed. They were generally over the counter. You could buy and sell grain at the gate. There were middlemen involved in these markets as well as in the open markets. Factors and jobbers. We can see evidence in the 17th century that they actually kept what we might think of as derivatives books, that they had cash-settled futures contracts, although in many cases these are really just contracts for difference. And of course, some of the contracts were usurious, and there were concerns about market abuse. So again, this is not that much different from today, but I wanted to illustrate to you that there is in fact a wider phenomenon of grain trading in this period, and that the corn returns really do only capture about half of it. But there's also very good reason to think that these markets are fairly thoroughly arbitraged. Now, in terms of market fairs and market towns, again, you can see, and I put this up simply because it gets at the density or lack of density of agricultural markets in different parts of the country, and also of the market fairs. And I think what is the case, though, is that even in the mid-17th century, these are fairly well established, because if you look at these and you can see the regions where they are least dense and the regions where they are most dense, and you compare that to the 19th century, where one of my colleagues, Louise Pryor, has managed to locate the GPS location of all of the market towns and outports that the corn returns are surveying, you actually see that they're quite similar. And what we've been able to do is actually to locate specifically which street corner or which corn exchange these were traded in. So again, the density is fairly well established by the 17th century, but by the 19th century, this has exploded to approximately 400 markets that the state is actively monitoring. Now, it's also, again, important to say with respect to private marketing that it's not as if we didn't know about the extent of market abuse in these markets, that we aren't able to think about them systematically, because these are largely governed by manorial courts, and the manorial courts allowed complainants to prosecute offenses. And what we do know is that actually offenses related to the buying and selling of these goods in terms of usurious contracts and abuses of contracts for difference actually represented less than about 10% of the total complaints that people had. So most people were complaining about the quality of what was bought and sold, not about the way in which the market participants were behaving. And that's important later on in terms of trying to assess the level of fraud around the reporting of the corn returns themselves. What we also know is that even in the 17th century, there's an awful lot of corn dealing outside the region in which the corn is produced. What you can see here is that a significant proportion of the buyer and sellers are living in different counties, even by the mid-17th century, and that very often, actually, up to a third of the buyers and sellers are living in different regions. So what we know is that people did actively buy and sell grain from one region to another, and that approximately a third of the people, say, in Norfolk or Suffolk, buying or selling grain had actually come from further afield. So this is a well-integrated market in that respect. And again, the question is, why would the British state spend the resources it does trying to understand this market? And again, I think the reason for that has significant implications for the way we think about the regulation of financial markets today. But what we know about the corn returns is that they were established in 1685 under James II. They were reestablished and enlarged under George III. Both of these monarchs have fairly bad reputations for absolutism, for abuse of private property rights, and for other things, but they certainly were concerned about the regulation of the grain trade. And even the initial corn returns in 1685 tracked 5 commodities. Those 5 commodities were wheat, barley, rye, oats, and peas. And the reason they chose these is that wheat obviously is the key ingredient in bread, barley is the key ingredient in beer, rye and oats are obvious substitute goods. So if the price of wheat is too high, then a poor person is going to go out and use rye or oats instead to make bread. And peas were important because peas were used as livestock feed. So they tracked these 5 commodities, prices and quantities, in the outports in the major market towns. And again, by the 1840s, this had grown from about 15 markets they were tracking to up to 280. And what they did is they required that the trading factors, the people who they identified as non-retail traders, produce their trading accounts every week for inspection. They had to produce them under oath, and nominated persons who were appointed by the justices of the peace inspected these, recorded all of the grain that was bought and sold, averaged it on a weighted basis. Initially, they had a simple average, and then they shifted to a weighted average, and then returned those weights to the commissioners. And again, despite problems, there's actually remarkable consistency and accuracy to this. When Dr. Pryor assisted with the development of the corn returns site, I think we discovered about 98% of the markets returned at any given time. So there's actually not much data being lost in this. And even from the 1690s, this material was being made widely available. John Houghton, who many of you may know in the context of Houghton Street and the London School of Economics, was also the first merchant to be elected Fellow of the Royal Society. He was an apothecary, an exotic grocer, an excise officer, and ultimately a newspaperman. What he did was to publish the corn returns in the 1690s. He actually published them alongside the prices of various stocks and bonds and the prices of lumber, timber, textiles, other things that he thought his clients might be interested in. And although this graph, I think, is not reproducing as well as I might like, what you can see is actually each of the areas, Worcester, Windsor, various Lynn Regis, Bangor, each of the locations that he's identified in the corn returns, he reports the prices of each of these commodities. And in this case, he actually also reports the high and the low so that his correspondents can see both how prices vary in different regions and also can make judgments about where to market their own grain. And again, this is one of 583 such price currents from this 10-year period, which means that he's publishing one approximately fortnightly, although there are periods when he doesn't publish at all because he doesn't have access to the data or to the paper needed to print his periodical. So again, this is something that happens very early, and it happens because they're interested in enforcing these corn bounties, which I'll talk about momentarily. But what I also want to suggest is that it's not, and again, here's another one which I think is perhaps a bit more readable, and it's not just corn and wheat, rye, barley, and oats that he's reporting. He's also reporting stock market prices, which he calls actions. He's reporting foreign exchange, and he's reporting births and marriages and deaths in various regions. And some people have used these early financial newspapers to argue that people are engaging in portfolio allocation, that they're making choices about whether to invest their money in stocks or to invest their money in agricultural land in order to earn returns on that. I don't think there's much evidence for that, but what I think is important about these is to realize that the data that the British state was collecting was not just going in a chest someplace, but was actually being used actively by the public even in the 1690s. So what happens after that? What happens after that is a series of magazines that are directed towards the gentry. The Gentleman's Magazine, the Universal Magazine, other such periodicals begin publishing these corn returns, sometimes in truncated form. Universal Magazine, for interest, in 1750 thinks that only 5 of these are of interest to its audience. So as a consequence, it publishes Bear Key, which is London, Basingstoke, which is Hampshire, Reading, Oxford, Henley, and Westminster, because its readership is obviously in the south of England. But the point is that this is very, very widely disseminated, again, alongside the prices of stocks, which is to say joint stock companies that you can trade in the 18th century. So again, this is not the case that in 1770 something happened and the state suddenly collected this data. It had been doing it for quite some time. But in the 1770s, something did happen in the sense that the Parliament decided that the London Gazette should publish this data, and that it should do so officially on a weekly basis, that it wouldn't just be up to newspapermen who thought it might be interesting to their customers to publish it, that it was something that everybody needed to have access to on a weekly basis. So the 1770 legislation insisted that the London Gazette publish the corn returns. And again, they start out with a number of inland counties and a number of outports along the coast. And they do it for wheat, rye, barley, oats, and beans. And initially, they're publishing just prices. Later on, they decide to add quantities as well. And what we can see is that by 1831, they have established this in tabular form. It looks identical every week, and the data is there for anyone who needs to use it, and it is quite extensive. And again, it grows to 280 such market towns. And the arguments persist about how reliable these weighted averages are people tampering with them, but all of the research that we've done with this, and also the research that a rival group out of Bristol has done with this, has suggested that they actually are a reliable guide to what was bought and sold in these markets. Now, again, this is an enormous expenditure of resources on the part of the British state. The idea that you would have justices of the peace, who of course are voluntary, they're not being paid, find somebody locally who's also a volunteer, who's willing to monitor a corn market without having any stake in it, without being somebody who's trading in those markets, but is just willing to do it out of a sense of civic duty, but is willing to collect all of this data and return it to the corn commissioners who are paid, who would then have to process the data and then send it to the London Gazette, which then prints this data, is an enormous undertaking. And we've come to appreciate what an enormous undertaking it is when we undertook to digitize the results of this. And again, you're talking 6 million data points over a period of approximately 100 years, 1760 to 1865. And we're digitizing it on the basis of the PDFs made available by the London Gazette. It was an enormous undertaking. It was paid for by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And again, it's available for download. We would encourage you, if you're interested in this data, to have a look at it. But bear in mind that unless you tell us who you are, you can only access 10 markets at a time. So really, if you are interested in this data, please register. Please tell us what you want with it, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you about it, particularly if you're doing primary research. And again, this is the website, the Corn Returns Online. And you'll be able to not only see the maps of the various markets and how they change over time in cross-section from 1825 to 1865, you'll also be able to do some data visualization. You'll be able to download it, and you'll have some suggestions for extra reading. But to give you a sense of what this data visualization is about, this is, for instance, for a 40-year period in Loughborough, which of course is in Leicestershire. We've got wheat, barley, oats, and rye. And what you can see is, on the one hand, these commodities, with the exception of wheat, are quite highly correlated. But moreover, that wheat is really quite volatile in this period. The other commodities somewhat less so, which is what you'd expect if they were substitution goods. But you can do this for every one of the 280 market towns. And if you wish also to compare them within a particular region, or even compare them across regions, you could look at all of the markets in Middlesex or all of the markets in Oxfordshire. You could compare the markets in Middlesex and the markets in Oxfordshire. You can see in this case, actually, by the middle of the 19th century, these markets are well integrated indeed, whereas in previous periods they were less so. But this is all available for you, and we really do want you to use it. That's why we put it out there. And if you have any questions about it, contact us through the website. We'd be delighted to help make it available to you for your own research. But again, what are we talking about? We're talking about grain markets that are really quite local and in some cases quite heavily concentrated. And again, Dr. Pryor has found the location of the grain markets. So if you wish to use these to relate them to nearby canals or nearby railroads, as we're doing in some other research, you can. But I think the key thing is, again, to recognize that the state has committed itself to this degree of market monitoring in a period in which doing so is really non-trivial. Okay, so what are we doing with this data? Since I've suggested there are a number of things you can do with it. The first thing we're doing with this data is looking to see structurally what accelerated market integration. Because on the one hand, you have the coming of the canals, canal mania, you have the coming of the railroads, and the Cambridge Population Group has taken all of the data on the building of canals and has effectively built a model of how the canal network expanded between 1770 and 1820, and we're relating that to the corn prices and corn markets to understand the effect of the canals on market integration of agriculture. We're doing the same thing with the railroads from, say, the 1830s to the late 1850s. We've also got all of the data on the coming of country banks and are able to relate the proximity of country banks to the growth of these markets, likewise with post offices. So we're beginning to explore structurally what actually underpins the progress of British agriculture in the early 19th century. And the question is, why does this matter? The reason this matters is that one thing that still hasn't been satisfactorily explained is why is it that the population of Britain in 1760s, 1770s was still hovering around 7 to 8 million people, whereas by 1850 it had grown to over 22 million people. So in the space of a couple generations, you've got massive population growth. And Thomas Malthus and others were predicting population implosion. They were predicting what we call a Malthusian crisis, that this would collapse. It doesn't collapse. Instead, British agriculture proves up to the task, proves able to sustain that kind of population growth. And what we're trying to do is understand why. And part of it is to understand what happened structurally, because before you get into debates about whether or not the Corn Laws helped, whether or not protecting British agriculture was a good thing, it's first necessary to understand structurally what's going on in the economy. So we have identified those as the main structural factors. And if any of you have any other structural factors you'd like to suggest, by all means, raise your hand and let us know. But again, we're ultimately trying to explain the different trajectories because we know that something very different happened in Ireland. We know that Ireland actually experienced a Malthusian crisis. 1 million people died. Irish agriculture was not self-sufficient, and Ireland didn't recover its population until the 1960s, whereas England actually prospered in this period. So understanding that is important. But also it's necessary to ask whether or not this regulatory regime benefited the agricultural sector at the expense of the industrial one. And given the difference in agricultural prices and industrial prices, which I'll show you a little bit later in the talk, if you believe those numbers, it's a wonder that Britain industrialized at all. And if you believe what the Anti-Corn Law League was saying about the way in which the Corn Laws represented a tax on industry, it's a wonder that Britain industrialized at all. So there's some really important empirical questions that have to be resolved, and digitizing this data is the only way to get about doing it. But more than that, this is also a kind of case study in big data, because if you think about the way economic history is done, what generally happens is you've got a graph like the one I showed you in Adam Smith, where you have annual prices of wheat from 1595 to 1660, and you have at most a couple of hundred data points. You do a number of regressions. Yes, you have tools available now to do multivariate regression analysis, but it's really very simple compared to asset prices. This data set of the corn returns with 6 million data points is getting closer to big data, but it's big data in a very constrained way and big data in a historical way. So what we're beginning to think about doing is how you can use machine learning tools to understand the structures that we believe exist in these markets. And if you can do it for data on the 19th century, then there's reason to think that it might be useful for data in the 21st century. So this is kind of a laboratory, a testing ground to see whether these machine learning tools are actually appropriate for thinking about these kinds of markets in the hopes that you might be able to apply them to different markets. So there are methodological issues as well. But finally, there are these classic debates in political economy that need to be resolved. And actually, the only way to really do that is to look seriously at this data, because the participants in these debates thought seriously about this data. Okay, so again, in terms of agricultural versus industrial prices, if you believe this graph, it's very hard to explain why the Industrial Revolution happened, because industrial prices are considerably lower than agricultural prices, and all of those merchants who wish to see the Corn Laws repealed are insisting that the Corn Laws represent a tax on them, because if agricultural prices are this much higher, then the food that their labor has to buy will push up wages, and that effectively what you're doing is transferring the profits of one sector to the profits of another. So it's important to understand whether or not this is correct, and if it is, what explains then the motive for industrializing at all, and in terms of the terms of trade, whether this is actually plausible or not. Because again, what this suggests is that it increases over time, which again is very difficult to explain if you assume that these are frictionless markets. Okay, so let's think again about the Corn Laws and go back to their infancy. They date from the 1690s. Actually, there was a momentary attempt even in the 1670s to impose them. They are not the product of the Napoleonic Wars, which is what you read about in school. They tell you in school that you have a continental blockade, all this marginal agriculture gets put into production, the gentry are making out like bandits, the Napoleonic War ends, the gentry don't want to lose their economic rents, so they lobby for Parliament to keep the Corn Laws. That's not the case. The Corn Laws date from the 1690s, and they were initially used to address a very different problem. They were a deliberate attempt by the Georgical Committee, which was one of the subcommittees of the Royal Society, to get people, particularly the gentry, to invest capital in domestic agriculture. And they did that by guaranteeing a form of price support. They were also, at the same time, meant to help consumers, because after the English Civil Wars, it became very difficult to enforce the assizes on bread and beer, because these assizes had fallen by the wayside during the 1640s and 50s, and reinstituting them in 1660 was very, very difficult in practice. So it was an alternative to having assizes on bread and beer. Assizes are price controls. Maximum price you can charge for beer and bread and beer. The idea is actually we won't do it that way. What we'll do is to try to reduce the volatility of the underlying prices of grain. So what they did is they ended up imposing tariffs on imported grain, as well as export bounties on grain, domestic grain that was exported to the Baltic, to the Netherlands in the first instance, with the idea that this would provide price support for farmers. And it was so successful that eventually the export bounties eclipsed the revenue from tariffs, which posed a significant problem for the Treasury, because by the 1720s, the Treasury was paying out more in export bounties than it was taking in tariffs. And the question was what to do about that. Now, this also had implications for international competitiveness, and again, people who would defend mercantilism in this period use the example of the English malt trade, because what happens is these export bounties encourage the export of English malt, and eventually it kills off the Dutch malting business, and all Dutch beer uses English malt in its production in the early 18th century as a consequence of these corn bounties. So they actually do matter in terms of international competitiveness, but in the first instance, they're really done to reduce volatility and to discourage speculation in corn markets. Now, again, this is initially because they want to be able to set the correct tariff. If you're going to have a tariff schedule that disappears as prices rise, then you've got to be able to monitor these prices. So choosing 12 ports and monitoring the prices in the ports and monitoring the prices in the most proximate market town is a way of adjusting your rate schedule should you find that the price is either increasing or decreasing. And of course, what John Houghton is trying to do is to point out to people that prices paid in one port may be rather different from prices in another port, and that it is possible to either arbitrage these or to think seriously about why these differences have occurred. But they're also, at the same time, not just used to monitor whether or not the corn bounties rate schedule is being set at the correct level. They're also used at the same time to judge the effects of changes in the excise rates on agricultural prices. Now you may ask, what's that about? I just said that the reason you had the corn bounties at all was to help consumers given concerns about the prices of bread and beer. Beer turns out to be a big part of household budgets in this period. And there's a very big concern about what the effect of the price of barley does to the price of beer, and also whether or not changes in the excise rates on beer will increase the price of beer for the consumer, or whether it will decrease the price that brewers are willing to pay to farmers for their corn. So the excise actually turns out to be economically very important. And although we don't yet have a theory of tax incidence, that's something that really comes out of this period in the early 18th century. The state's very concerned to tell whether or not raising the duty has a bad effect on consumers or a bad effect on farmers. And the only way to do that is to measure these prices through the collection of this corn data. So it's also about taxation as well as about tariffs. Now again, I hope it comes as a surprise to most of you to know that even the 17th century state was worried about the effects of its tax policies and its tariff policies on the economy. That this is not something that comes out of the second half of the 20th century. But finally, it's used to mediate debates about the repeal of the Corn Laws of the 19th century, because by the time the early 19th century rolls around, the reality is that these price supports are very rarely kicking in. That for the most part, the prices never fall to the point where it's necessary to close the ports to imported grain. And actually, in most cases, by the time you get to the 1820s and 1830s, these tariffs are not kicking in at all, and imported grain is imported tariff-free. So in a sense, the Corn Laws are eventually repealed because they become a dead letter. But the only way you know that is because you've managed to monitor these on a weekly basis. So to come back to this question about their corn returns and the excise, because I think, again, this is an enormous undertaking on the part of the government to monitor corn markets with the idea of correctly setting tax rates. What's going on here? Gregory King in 1695 identifies it as the largest household cash expense for the poor and middling sort. And he, in fact, actually is able to estimate how the average household spends its income. And Gregory King is looking at this for a simple wage earner that makes 5 shillings a year. He's looking at it for a middling income family that makes 25 to 50 shillings a year, and then he's looking at it for more wealthy gentry families. But this snapshot is extremely important to economic historians because it's the only evidence we have of how households consumed in the 17th and 18th century. But what you can see here is actually ale and beer represents the biggest single household expense, far more than bread, which is the blue chunk, and much more than meat, for instance, or wine and spirits. Beer is that very large chunk. So knowing that, what the state recognizes is that only the very well-off could afford to brew at home. So only very rich people are avoiding buying beer that is subject to taxation. So this produces periodic calls for taxes on malt and taxes on hops, because the idea is that it would be much more equitable for the state to tax the ingredients of beer, because that would tax the gentry families that were brewing beer at home, as well as the poorer people who are buying beer on the street. So the question then is, how do you decide whether or not that's a good idea? The way the British state decided that that was a good idea was to observe whether or not changes in the excise rates on beer affected the price of beer or whether they affected the price of corn. And they actually did this in the 1690s, and that led them to introduce a malt tax, and then in the 1710s it led them to introduce a hops tax. And again, they know that beer production assumes a significant portion of agricultural produce, up to 50%. And although they identified they debated the effects of this very, very fiercely and very seriously, they always did it with reference to these corn prices. They always came back and said that this is because we know that this has had this effect or had that effect. And again, I think this is very interesting because this is not how we generally think about mercantilism. We think about mercantilism as the king's friends telling him that the way in which a state thrives in this period is to have a positive balance of trade, to have a lot of treasure in its chests. We don't imagine that the mercantilists were out there measuring the price of grain and using that to argue that you need to change your tax mix in order to be fairer to the poor or fairer to the landowners. So this opens up a whole world on what this early political economy looks like. And it turns out that it's not nearly as strident and not nearly as simple-minded as many people like to assume. But again, we also find that very early on in the 18th century, the people who were looking at this corn data made a distinction between the legal incidence of a tax, which is to say who legally has to pay the tax, the idea that this tax falls on the brewer, and the real incidence of the tax, which is to say, does it fall on the wage earner? Does it fall ultimately on wages? Does it fall ultimately on consumers? Does it fall ultimately on farmers? That's a very sophisticated argument, and one that's very often lost today when we talk about taxation, because today we tend to assume that either the legal incidence of the tax is the incidence of the tax, or we assume that you have a perfect equilibrium condition and the taxes always fall on wages. Whereas they were aware that both wages and prices had friction, and though they didn't use the word friction, they talked about them in terms of not being able to shift very quickly, and they recognized that the stickiness of this might create inequalities, and they wanted to address those. So again, this is a commitment of resources to monitor prices with the idea of thinking more widely about policy. And if you can do it in the 18th century, I like to think you can do it today. And hopefully what you're hearing from me today is a call to encourage not only our policymakers and our legal representatives, but also academics to think more seriously about the real effects of these policies rather than the theoretical ones. So a view from a grain merchant, even in 1694, this guy is going on about the fact that you've had, after King William comes to the throne, both a double and a triple excise tax. And what he's done is looked at the data and said, actually, the effects on this are very, very bad for the farmers and ultimately also very bad for the treasury, and he ends up being correct. But the interesting thing about William Stockton is he's also somebody who made a fortune in the 1670s speculating on grain prices as a result of the changes in the excise duties and speculating on grain prices in anticipation of bounties. So these guys are very, very clued up about these markets. So again, I've shown you that. So we know that the corn returns fueled the debate because they were used to decide whether or not you should open a port, what tariff was chargeable, and what, if any, bounty might be paid. We know by the 19th century that they're widely reported in local newspapers, because one problem with the corn returns when these were first discussed in the 1970s is that some scholars said, oh, that's all well and good, but who subscribes to the London Gazette? Well, turns out not many people subscribe to the London Gazette, but everybody subscribes to their local newspaper, and the local newspaper reproduces, just as I showed you the Universal Magazine did, the corn returns for the counties in question. So these are very highly disseminated. It's hard to imagine that a literate person in 19th century England would not have had contact with these, just as it's hard to imagine that a literate person in the 1980s would not have had contact with listings on the New York Stock Exchange, because they were in the back of every paper in the Western world. Okay, and again, corn factors and industrialists use them to argue for the repeal of the corn laws. Corn factors were essentially saying that they were that the artificial manipulation of prices at this point was indefensible. Industrialists are saying that this represented a tax on them, whereas farmers and landowners used to argue for their continuance. And again, this is very often seen simply as a debate about economic interest. The assumption is that industrialists want cheaper food, farmers want economic rents, and it's very rarely that we take seriously the fact that the people who are making these arguments are actually relying on the price data to do so. But I think the most important debate about political economy in this period, and the most important formulation of the debates about the repeals of the corn laws, or this rather famous debate between Malthus and Ricardo. And what's very interesting about this debate is that it's not just about whether or not you should repeal the corn laws. Malthus and Ricardo, by debating the corn laws, arrive at different concepts of economic rent. Ricardo ends up arguing that that rent is, in fact, the residual value in excess of the production value. Okay, so he's able to calculate what he sees as that residual value, and he's able to do it. He's got this corn price factor model. He's able to do it because he's able to go to the newspaper every week and to see the fluctuations in these prices and to calculate an average residual value over time and to argue that that's theoretically sustainable. And again, it's not purely a theoretical argument. It turns on movements of prices and rents. And the thing that they're able to do, because they have this corn price data, and they also have, in Ricardo's case, rent records from his own estates that go back into the 18th century, they were able to see that agricultural rents in this period are increasing much faster than prices. So you have price volatility, but you don't have a lot of price inflation, whereas you have a massive increase in agricultural rents over the late 18th and early 19th century, partly as a result of population growth, but partly for other reasons as well. And it's very easy, looking at this data, for Ricardo to say that that it's this residual that is the issue, because rents are increasing much more rapidly than prices. Okay. Now, Malthus, on the other hand, essentially adopts the version of economic rent that you see in Adam Smith, and eventually comes around and admits a few years later that he thinks that Ricardo was right. But I think today what we would say is they're not exactly debating the same thing. they're not debating the same thing in that these two theoretical positions aren't talking directly to each other. But what's interesting is that they're arriving at these two different formulations of rent by looking at the same data sets. Now, Haijun Chang sees the Corn Laws as responsible for the Industrial Revolution, but it's very clear that many of his contemporaries disagreed. And again, they disagreed because they believed that this is representing a tax on the industrial sector, and moreover, that the effects of the Corn Laws are felt most in the regions furthest inland, in the Midlands, where agriculture is most heavily intensified. Industrialization is most heavily intensified. So you've got this Malthus versus Ricardo debate, but that's only the first of these debates. I think the much more interesting one in terms of political economy goes beyond the Corn Laws to this question of the commutation of tithes, because this is the really serious issue for political economy after the Restoration. It's a serious issue for Smith in the 18th century, and it's one that Malthus and Ricardo are also trying to get to grips with. And that is, what do you do with the fact that in ecclesiastical lands, 10% of the agricultural produce is gone over to the church? You have to tie 10% of the produce of the land to the church. And in the case of the ecclesiastical land that changed hands under Henry VIII, or changed hands under 1640s and 1650s under Parliament, then that tithe has to be made to private landlords. So Adam Smith's long discussion on his digression on silver is designed to point out that those landlords who receive tithes in produce or rent in produce are much better off than those who are receiving them in money. And it was accepted from the 1660s onwards that this system was actually quite unjust, that it was preferable to commute these tithes into a monetary equivalent, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. So from 1660 to 1836, there are these constant calls to commute these tithes, but it isn't at all clear how you will go about doing it. And eventually in 1836, after the Great Reform Act, this is forced through Parliament, and the commutation of tithes begins. And again, it takes 50 years to renegotiate all of these contracts in such a way as to make it possible to convert the tithes to money. But they do it because they are able to appoint commissioners who commute these tithes, and they do it because they have access to these corn returns, and they're able to actually estimate what is an equitable commutation. And without access to these corn returns, there would have been endless squabbling about what was equitable. But if you could go back and look at this for the last 50 years, because it had been recorded in the London Gazette, it was easy to make your case. And what they were surprised to discover is that the vast majority of these commutation negotiations were resolved privately. They didn't even have to involve the commissioner because everybody accepted what these prices were. They knew where to find them, and it wasn't necessary for the commissioner to get involved and to negotiate the equitable amount. So these played a really key role in the last dismantling of the manorial system in Britain, because people were able to accept that these were reliable and transparent and were able to use them as a basis for private negotiations. So I think it is the case that this is influential not just in government policy, but also in resolving what otherwise would have been extremely contentious private disputes. So again, this is critical because agricultural rents are increasing in this period vastly faster than agricultural prices. We saw that there's volatility in agricultural prices, but there's nothing like the vast increase in agricultural rents. So what conclusions can we draw from this? I think the most important conclusion is that this is an enormously expensive and extensive undertaking by the early modern state. That even in the 1690s, this was costing tens of thousands of pounds a year for the English state to administer. And when the average London family makes 50,000 pounds a year, that gives you some basis for estimating what kind of expense this represents. They were used initially to regulate the corn bounties, but the data was in the 18th century mobilized for a range of other purposes, most importantly to resolve what was equitable with respect to excise taxation, but equally they were useful to people who subscribed to these gentlemen's magazines and universal magazines in order to estimate and understand where best to market their grain. They were consumed widely, and they were used in the 1760s to effectively ban the distilling of corn, because You also had periods of dearth, the 1760s being the most extreme one, where the state was able to say that the distilling trade is contributing to corn being, wheat and barley being so highly priced that the people can't afford them, so they actually banned corn distilling for a 6-year period before permitting them again. So they're widely used in the 18th century for a range, to mediate a range of social policies. They're crucial to furnishing empirical support for debates about the repeal of the corn laws, because without recourse to this data, it would have been very difficult to establish the extent to which this argument about it being a tax on manufacturing was correct, but more importantly, it would have been difficult to establish that it was essentially a dead letter by the time of its repeal. And likewise, it proves critical in the commutation of tithes, so it's used in an entirely different context even after the corn laws were repealed. And what's interesting today is that you can still find the corn returns, but today the British state is not collecting the corn returns. The HCGA, which is the Cereal Growers Association, is collecting the corn returns, and they are doing it in precisely the same way as they were doing it in the 19th century. And you can actually go online and see this series extend from 1914, when it stops being published in the London Gazette, on through to the present. So it's not just 100 years of British agriculture, even 200 years of British agriculture. It's now pushing on 350 years of British agriculture that is being tracked through a mechanism that was established in 1685. So hopefully this will make you rethink political economy. The next time you pick up Adam Smith, or the next time you pick up David Ricardo or Thomas Malthus, recognize that they're not just reasoning from first principles. The classical political economy is not just moral philosophy. Certainly it is that, in the sense that they had different ideas about what economics was supposed to do and how you interpreted the theoretical formulations they made. But they weren't just reasoning as if empirical data didn't matter. They knew empirical data mattered, and the reason they had a corn market model was not just to simplify for the sake of argument, but it was because the corn market was what you had data for. And that is not what we believe about political economy. What we believe about political economy is that this is a type of reasoning that has been completely disregarded by modern economics, that modern economics has gone over to probabilistic thinking, has become obsessed with empirics, and has lost that kind of theoretical and moral root. And what I want to suggest is that yes, moral economy, political economy in its moral philosophy matters, but likewise so does the empirical side. And it matters because that empirical evidence was available to the people who first did this kind of thinking at all. And again, hopefully that is the most important message you'll take away from this. And I've left deliberately about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, thank you.